All right, everyone. Brexit is supposedly going to be moving forward at the end of this month, less than 4 weeks now to go. Whether that actually ends up taking place, though, is anyone's guess. It's totally up in the air. A lot of leaders within the EU now at this point, I think, are getting tired of the UK's internal antics and are saying, just look, if you can't hammer out a deal that you can possibly accept internally, then just fucking go. People within the UK, I think, are getting tired of the situation. I would be too. If I were, a citizen of the UK, I'd say shit or get off the pot, essentially. At some point, a decision has to be made. The will of the people has already been executed insofar as holding a referendum. It's funny when people who are, what you would term Ramoners, are saying, well, we need a people's vote. You already had one. That's why you have Brexit. You may not like the fallout from that, and I understand some of these people wanted a sensible Brexit that would involve an actual exit deal that would allow trade to continue. That's probably not going to happen, but you can't blame Brexiteers for that. You have to blame Theresa May and the EU. You have to blame people that never wanted a Brexit to begin with, the EU that wants to punish you, not Nigel Farage, but Juncker, who's now coming out and expressing concern, actually, over whether a deal can even be achieved, like ever potentially be reached because of the posturing. And then Theresa May, who was a Remainer. She was not pro-Brexit. You put her in charge of negotiating something she didn't even campaign for or want. And then you wonder why she brought back a shitty deal that couldn't be possibly accepted by the people of the United Kingdom. The reason for that is because it wasn't meant to be accepted. They want one of several situations is what the Remainers, the globalists, actually want. Number one would be a reversal of Brexit. It's not clear that can legally happen, though. Number two would be a hard Brexit that causes enough chaos, and I'm sure that they'll help this along because their globalist buddies control all of your monetary system. They'll try to destroy the UK's economy enough so that the people will come crawling back to the EU and re-enslave themselves to globalism, rather than do what a sane, rational person would do and attempt to hammer out trade deals elsewhere, reconfigure the economy for the modern century as opposed to the EU, which is from last century, and attempt to modernize and progress and go forward. The EU is now a relic of the Cold War mentality, and that's why it will eventually collapse. The European Union will not last. It's just a matter of how much chaos has to occur before people realize how bad it really is. The problem is you can't take first and third world countries and put them in the same currency. That makes no sense. You can't have a conglomeration of nations whose cultures reject and accept, to varying extreme degrees in some cases, the idea of human migration, the idea of multiculturalism. You can't smash together nations that have a very long history of being very free and countries that are, maybe a lot less so. You can't conglomerate these things together under a post-national authority that's derived from the upper echelons of these cultures and a bunch of bigwig family names. Give them basically oligarchic power and expect there to be a good outcome. The structure and function of the EU is just fundamentally flawed from the ground up. It's good that the UK is exempting itself from it. Other EU states should definitely follow suit. They should all have their own referendums. I have a feeling some of them would split off and it would collapse the EU entirely. The thing is, if you're in the EU, if you're Juncker or you're Merkel, if you're one of the globalists within the EU, you're loyal to Europe, not to your own home country. You're loyal to a post-nationalist federation. You're probably very worried because if the UK does leave, especially under a hard Brexit, and then does well, it looks terrible for the EU. Oh, look, we left, we're doing just fine, essentially, and then other people will be emboldened by that. They are going to try to make an example of the UK. It will be dirty dealing and shenanigans from the ground up. What'll happen is that they'll call on their corporate buddies and banks and all of these things to try to hammer the UK as hard as possible. They want as many people unemployed as they can. They want as much economic downturn as possible. The military hazards if possible. Chaos in the streets. They'll try to foment revolution if possible. Because they're going to try to make an example of the UK and say, look, if you leave the EU, the wolves are at the door and they'll rip you apart, essentially. Keep paying us the blood money. Keep enslaving your people to us. Give us more power to protect you from these evils that are outside of the European economic community. That's what will happen. I think the UK should have a hard Brexit, immediately swing around, make use of the fact that it has ties to the Commonwealth states, to the United States, so forth, build up a different, more powerful economic alliance, and then progress into this century, because right now it's being held back in the 1900s. That's where Europe currently is. Stylistically, in some cases, no offense, because things here are pretty great, but the European Union is not the reason why they're good. The European Union is the reason why they're not as good as they could be. That's basically what that entails, because you're giving a bunch of money and power to this post-national authority that doesn't actually need to exist. I've had people legitimately claim, seriously claim to me, that in the absence of the EU, the European countries would all be fighting and going to war with each other. That doesn't make any sense, because the European Union didn't exist, and yet there was peace for several decades anyway. Before the European Union was fomented and came to pass, and then you have a long period where it's not anything like it is in its current form. At the very least, you should be talking about reforming the EU, which a lot of the Eastern European nations are. There's no will to do so, it seems, among the Merkelites, because reform means less money. You want problems, because if you have problems, then you can sell people non-working solutions that simply ingratiate yourself, that get you more money, that get you more power, and then you can have more latitude to cause more problems. All you have to do is create a society. If you want to be the ultimate tyrant, you create a society that feels free but isn't, in which there are problems for which there are solutions that never actually work, that are sold by the state to justify its continued top-down existence. That's what you create if you want an authoritarian but stable society. That's what the European Union has fundamentally begun to morph into, away from its initial goal, which was more benevolent, I think, in the minds of most of the people that formed. And I understand some people say, well, no, from day one it was an attempt to enslave people. Well, just because that's the central plan of some of the people that design a system doesn't mean everyone's in the know. You've got to understand that there are other people, that the worst people, arguably, in a situation like that are those motivated by a desire to do good, because they're more self-righteous. They actually think that they're fighting for justice, so they'll fight harder. They've got a motivation, even if they're totally wrong. Brexit should go forward. It should be a hard no-deal Brexit. There shouldn't be a deal. If the European Union is really going to act that draconian towards one of its former members, a major world economy, would have been, formerly second largest in the European Union. If they're going to act like that towards the UK, what does that say, really, about ultimately the strength of the European Union? If they have to lash out so much at a rogue member that's decided to call it quits, which is their right under the European Union's own framework, what would they do to a smaller economy? What are they willing to do to their own internal population? I think if you really seriously ask yourself that, you won't like the answer if you're a European. That's about all. Peace out.